Hello everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the Kino Tsoi Community Podcast. This podcast is created with the goal of analyzing the works of Victor Tsoi and the Soviet-Russian rock group Kino. The band was formed in modern-day St. Petersburg and became one of the most influential contemporary music groups in Russia and post-Soviet countries. And Victor Tsoi, as the frontman, became one of the most popular youth figures during the times of Perestroika, performing for Soviet television, taking interviews with the press, and touring inside and outside of the communist bloc. Each episode of this podcast will follow a general format. First, we will introduce the song and briefly describe its origin or theme. Then we will read the lyrics of the song line by line, first in the original Russian language, then translated to English. Along the way, we will attempt to decipher the text and the meaning of the song ourselves, as well as explore alternate interpretations. One thing which will become very clear throughout this podcast is that Victor's songs can be taken in many different directions. Some of these differences come from varying and opposing perceptions of the subjects Victor hinted at, while other times it involves the challenges of translation from the Russian text. The first song we will cover in this podcast is, in fact, the very first song from Kino that I ever listened to. During the pandemic, I was trying to find artists from Russia to listen to, as I was already learning the language for over a year. This was when, after a rendezvous with individual songs from different bands, I stumbled upon the work of Kino very late at night. By next morning, I was telling all my friends about the songs I found and the band's history. And these were the first words I ever heard from Victor. Вместо тепла – зелень стекла. A green glass bottle instead of warmth. Вместо огня – дым, and smoke instead of fire. Из сетки календаря выхвачен день. A day is snipped off the calendar. Красное солнце сгорает дотла. The red sun burns to the ground. День догорает с ним. The day burns out with it. На пылающий город падает тень. A shadow falls on the burning city. At first, the song appears to offer a grim picture of life. From the first lines, we can infer that people living here are resorting to alcohol addiction as a substitute for quote-unquote warmth, that is, meaningful relations with others or the outside world. The time they have left to live like this is simply written off and spent waiting for something to change. Peremen требуют наши сердца. Changes our hearts demand. Peremen требуют наши глаза. Changes our eyes demand. В нашем смехе, in our laughter, и в наших слезах, in our tears, и в пульсации вен, and in the pulses of our veins. Перемен, мы ждем перемен. Changes, we're waiting for changes. Электрический свет продолжает наш день. Electric light keeps our day going. И коробка от спичек пуста, and the matchbox is empty. Но на кухне синим цветком горит газ, but the gas stove in the kitchen burns blue. Сигареты в руках, чай на столе, cigarettes in hand, tea on the table. Это тема проста. It's simple, nothing much. И больше нет ничего, все находится в нас. And there isn't anything else. All is within us. This second verse is essentially describing the means by which these people continue their daily lives. They've run out of matches, but can still light cigarettes with the gas stove. They don't have anything but smokes and drinks physically belonging to them. All is within us could mean the inner mental strength necessary to continue under such conditions, or the lack of nutritious goods left for the day. It may be describing the food shortages plaguing the Soviet economy in Victor's time. Мы не можем похвастаться мудростью глаз. We can't show off with the wisdom of our eyes, неумелыми жестами рук, or the able gestures of our hands. Нам не нужно все это, чтобы друг друга понять. We don't need all of this to understand one another. Сигареты в руках, чай на столе, Так замыкается круг. Cigarettes in hand, tea on the table, that's how the cycle is closed. И вдруг нам становится страшно что-то менять. And suddenly we're scared of changing anything at all. The third verse could represent the building of relationships between people stuck in said conditions and growing confidence to bring necessary change. Demonstrating individual power and opposing strength had not done any common good. The youth are strained to the point of putting aside their differences and demanding the changes their hearts, eyes, and nerves have been for a long time by this point. Changes to improve living conditions and relations between each other, either in the context of a family, friend group, or section of society. Peremen is essentially describing the wish to pursue certain goals based on inner thoughts, yet a crushing lack of methods for doing so. On the bright side, it suggests that compromise in beliefs and interests among individuals would lead to a better situation for everyone. Because of this perceived message of pursuing a goal of necessary changes, the song has been used in a wide range of circumstances and scenarios by all kinds of figures in Russian politics. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, claimed Viktor's song inspired him and Foreign Affairs Minister Andrei Gromyko to begin perestroika and the process of liberalization. In the 21st century, Peremen has been adopted as a protest song among various groups, particularly in opposition of Alexander Lukashenko's regime in Belarus, and most recently, detainment of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny and the country's invasion of Ukraine. On the flip side are views such as those held by Russian Deputy Yevgeny Fyodorov, who claimed Peremen was written in Hollywood by professionals specifically planning to cause the collapse of the Soviet Union through public hysteria. Peremen had grown to become a symbol of the tumultuous political and societal challenges for Russia and other post-Soviet countries. It is attributed as a symbolic anthem of the perestroika era, with both positive and negative meanings. But what did Viktor himself, as well as the other Kino members, think about such use of the song? I don't think of the song as a song of protest, and I don't understand at all what it needs to be in this light for, because to me it looks forced, like a false tooth. It was a rare occasion where he did not leave the fans guessing on the song's message. He did not want to become a piece of discourse in a society that was wildly changing. That being said, he was also not exactly a fan of the bodies of government who were, only a few years ago, banning recording and distribution of his music, warning of distortion of Soviet reality. I believe that everyone has the right to listen or not to listen. I was never part of the communist youth ranks. I hope that, by the 21st century, this organization ceases to exist. By writing and performing Peremen, Viktor more than anything contested the idea of certain voices overpowering others in the case of human conflict. Political and societal conflicts are just one of them. However, the consequence of these radical changes, accompanied with a type of song such as Peremen, are undeniable. It is something that Tsoi mentioned in his time, and the remaining members would go on to clarify. People who sing this song at protests are the source of jokes and laughter among musicians. Nothing more. Peremen was not written for a crowd, not for herds of people. The pronoun we used in the lyrics relates to a very small circle of people, the closest ones you possibly sit in the kitchen around every evening. It's all deeply personal. Yuri Kasparyan. Kino's relationship to Soviet and Russian politics is a topic we will no doubt return to in future episodes. But this is where we end off today with Peremen specifically. The song is an icon of dramatic political and social change in the Soviet Union, something which continues to be perpetuated by society itself well after Viktor's death. By describing a desperate living situation which can only be changed by making connections and setting aside differences, Peremen empowers the listener to pay attention to their inner feelings and find solutions to their own problems. The song's ability to apply to personal circumstances inevitably creates a deep and passionate connection that the listener holds onto and keeps coming back to it for. Thus is the genius of Peremen. Also, it makes for the perfect song to play while carefully driving over the speed limit in residential areas. Don't ask how I found that out. I hope you enjoyed the first episode of the Kino Tsoi podcast. If you'll stick around for a few more minutes, I will read to you some responses to a prompt I sent out to members of our community, asking to describe how they found Victor and how the music of Kino positively influenced on them. Let's start with our first response from Maxime. I first found Kino from just exploring Russian music as I am half Russian. I visited the country over 10 times, and so I was in love with Russian culture. When I discovered Russian rock, I instantly fell in love with it. I listened to all sorts of bands like Aquarium and DDT, but Kino was just my favorite of them all. I felt some similarities with Victor as I am half Russian, half Asian, and that I began to read more and more about his life and the underground rock scene in Russia. Eventually, I told my Russian mother about it, and she shared some of Victor's songs that she listened to. From then onwards, I've just kept listening to Kino, always finding a new song that I like. Moving on to our next response. The first time I remember hearing Kino was when my boyfriend put a playlist of Russian rock on in front of me, and Pachka Sigaret was one of the first songs. He seemed to have been into Kino, as I remember he tried to encourage me to listen before, but I wasn't into it all that much. But it was nice sharing that music together, and from then on I started to like Kino because I associated it with a good memory. After that, we watched Igla together and laughed about it. LMAO. And our last and by far longest response is from Simon. Even before I discovered Victor, I always saw fan arts of him. My best friend had him as a profile picture for a while, and for some reason I never bothered to ask her who it was, although I was curious. In retrospect, even though I'm a non-believer gentle scum, it felt as if some higher power was pushing me in the direction of discovering Kino. One night, YouTube algorithm randomly recommended Kukushka to me, and then Spokojnaya Noć. Perhaps my depressed mental state contributed as well, but I spent an hour crying while listening to those two songs on repeat. I wasn't bawling like a bitch, but more like continuous flow of tears. I think another reason why I cried was because I read that the frontman died early in such a tragic way. I don't know why that made me upset, because I always viewed death as some sort of release, not something to be upset about. I never really felt this sad upon discovering the early deaths of my other favorite musicians. Maybe it's the music alone that made me cry, or because his life and death meant so much to so many people, as the YouTube comment suggested. And it made me sad that such a great artist passed on so early, and the world was yet again refused of another great artist's future artworks. The comments were also very personal and intimate. It formed an idea in my head that for these people, Victor was more than a musician of his time, but more like a source of life, their last hero or voice of reason or something to that effect. And that is all I have for you today. Please let us know on our community pages in the description if you have any comments or ideas to help improve this series in the future. Otherwise, thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see you again when we cover the next Kino song. Paka paka.